So the talk that I'm going to give you today is really just to give you a bit of a taste of what's happening with climate change education in Canada. And okay, so here is a map of Canada for you without context. And here is where I'm from, the University of Ottawa, which is fairly south and rather east. To give you the context, here's Korea with 51.5 million people, 1,000 square kilometers. Uh-oh. Here we are with Canada. We have fewer people and about 100 times the area. So it really starts to give you an idea of magnitude, which is important when you think about hazard literacy and even climate change. Now, Canada is so large, we're divided into provinces and territories, and we have 13 different jurisdictions, 10 provinces and 3 territories. And each of those jurisdictions has its own say over things like healthcare and education. So we don't have one education system, we have 13. And then even within the provinces, there are some differences. Even though we have such a huge country, most of the population lives right along the border with the United States. So something like 60% live within 100 kilometers of the border. And then the other 40% are spread out. We're pretty sparse and we're unevenly distributed across the country. And we're really diverse. We have 2 official languages, which is something that many people know about Canada. We speak English and many people speak French, but we have 450 different ethnic and cultural origins. The multiple jurisdictions, as I reported, so provincial, territorial, but each school district in the province has say over what they're doing. Each school has some say in what they're doing, and we have English language schools, French language schools, independent religious schools, Indigenous run schools, alternative schools. So education in Canada is really complicated. So that's just good to know as you think about what I'm going to present about the curriculum documents and climate change. So the context for climate change in Canada. Well, we do have a fossil fuel sector, and the fossil fuel industry is very important in Alberta and Saskatchewan, so 2 of our provinces. That will, of course, color how policies are developed, how politicians vote, decisions that are made. We did belong to the Kyoto Protocol, but withdrew, and in the decade between 2006 and 2015, our emissions increased and climate initiatives decreased. So we went in the wrong direction in both cases. Another interesting fact, and it's also contradictory, so we're making more emissions, we're doing less about climate change, but concern for the economy is increasing, and we're supporting the oil and gas. But we're also keeping support for clean energy, so wind farms and solar initiatives. That goes hand in hand with, ready? 71% of Canadians believing that climate change was mostly caused by human activities in 2021. That's not bad, although it should be 100, but 70 is not bad. However, 4 years later, it had dropped to 63%. So going in the wrong direction. We should be doing better than that. Okay? So there's the context. Literacy has decreased. So with that as the backdrop, we've had researchers looking at, okay, where is climate change policy going? What's happening with it? And Beeler et al. Conducted a national study, and they looked at climate change policy, climate change education documents. And they found this is not good, that climate change inclusion was cursory and scarce, so that we weren't doing a very good job of climate change. And that it was there sometimes, but a sub-theme. So we might talk about environmental education or maybe science, but hardly ever climate change. So climate change policy documents said we need climate change education. But educational documents didn't mention climate change. So there's a mismatch there. And most of the attention in the climate change policies was we need energy efficient schools. So how will we heat and cool our schools in a sustainable or energy efficient way? So not really getting much at what students are learning and what they need to know and what kinds of changes we might be able to make with climate change. So that's the baseline study. Another group of researchers took a look at this and they said, okay, this is what Beeler et al. Found. There's a growing climate change emergency. We've got climate change anxiety in our youth. It's becoming more and more prevalent where the youth are distressed and depressed about what the future might hold because of climate change. So Field et al. Said, okay, let's look and see if we can find specifically climate change education just looking in curriculum documents. We're just going to focus on that and see if we can find even mentions of it. And they examined science curriculum, social studies curriculum, and then a group of documents they called other, just in case it was somewhere else. And they found quite a few mentions of climate change in science, except Manitoba, one of our jurisdictions, covers climate change in social studies. And there's actually room for that in other provinces, which might be of potential interest because of the power of socio-scientific issues, or SSI. So in other words, maybe climate change isn't just a science issue, a science education issue. Maybe it's bigger than that, and maybe if we bring in the social studies context or in a combination of the two. Okay, not looking bad. Then they dug a little deeper and they looked at the courses that students were required to take versus the elective courses, particularly grades 7 to 12. So most of our school systems, even though they do have a lot of differences, mandatory courses in science up to about grade 10, and then the students get to choose. And so the picture changes a little bit. So you can see that the dark colors are mandatory and the light color, is the elective. So the somewhat good news from the previous slide is less good because you have to choose to take these courses. Maybe they don't fit your schedule, maybe you don't know you will be interested in them. So many of our students are missing out on climate change education. Let's see if there's some more results I'm sure. So it's a little bit troublesome, even though they went with the view of maybe expanding on Beeler's work and saying, yes, there is more climate change there than we thought. Not so. So where is it? Where is climate change? What are we doing? Well, the next set of researchers decided they would look at sustainability education. Remember I showed you Manitoba had quite a few mentions of climate change. Well, Manitoba has taken the position that they use ESD, so Education for Sustainable Development. So maybe sustainable development is where things are hiding. So, and they said, like the earlier groups, no matter what we do, no matter where we look, climate change education just isn't existing in those documents. They had a different map though, and one thing they did point out was when it is happening, there are some patterns in how it is happening. And so the Education for Sustainable Development, and I mentioned Manitoba and then Quebec, that's in the dark green. So that's a particular slant towards how they are teaching the students and what they are teaching. environmental education, so that's Ontario and British Columbia and sort of the medium green. And then the light green is taking an Indigenous approach to education. So also very interesting, and also some possibilities for how we can encourage our students to learn and become responsible and active citizens. Oh, whoops. And so what those three things looked like, with some crossover. This isn't cut and dry. It doesn't mean everybody fits in the box, but sustainable development, you can see there's a focus on the anthropocentric view of sustainability, whereas Indigenous education is cultural values and spirituality, and biocentric, so putting nature first, not people first, which is maybe an important twist. The action that is encouraged in those different types of views towards environmental education or sustainable development. So we've got capacity building and the need for change at various levels. Student involvement in change, and students would expand to youth and individual level change. Whereas in the Indigenous education, we have engagement with family and community, so more of a holistic approach. And then even the pedagogies that are referenced or suggested for these three approaches are slightly different. We have interdisciplinary and inquiry-based, which is pretty common, but more of an emphasis on experiential learning or civic education, so maybe citizen scientist type things, or again, educating for future action. Whereas in the Indigenous approach, we have a story-based pedagogy or land-based skills, so actually going out and working on the land, using the land and animals, plants, etc., to learn about climate and what is happening. And then it's about attitudes and values. So very subtle but distinct differences there. And all of those have possibility for Canadians. These also might have possibility for the Korean context. But it still doesn't help us find climate change education in the Canadian curriculum. And so where is it? It's got to be there somewhere. We know it's important. It's part of this triple threat, the planetary crisis of climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss. So we've got to be doing something about it. And as it turns out, we are capturing that in environmental education approaches. And so you could kind of see that expanding as I went through, from specifically climate change, the words, to mentions of things relating to climate change, to environmental education approaches. And that's where it is for us. So in Canada, we look at environmental education as something that can equip students to take meaningful action. So not just learning about climate change, but actually thinking about what could be done to address it. How to navigate misinformation and disinformation, and how to be part of resilient and sustainable communities. And that resilience and sustainable is important, especially when you come to the policies for, okay, how do we adapt to climate change? I think many people have come to the realization it's changing. We can't change it back. We can maybe stop what is happening, or we can impact what is changing and how we react to it. But many of the documents in Canada written up to about 2020 focused on economic impacts. They were all about how businesses were losing money or how much money we had to put into the system. And I think we need to be paying attention to the human and non-human impacts, because that's what's going to keep our communities going. All right. Now, in 2025, Canadians put together, there were 700 people that participated in this effort. including 300 youth participants, which is really important and signaling the importance of bringing the youth into making decisions about climate change and what's going to be happening. And they have put together the National Framework for Environmental Learning. So we're not actually calling it climate change. We're going to call it environmental learning. It's going to encompass everything. What I love about this, amongst many things, is that, okay, sure, we have strong economy, but it's only a third, and we're looking at resilient humans and planetary wellness. So really acknowledging that it's not all about money and making money. We've got the triple threat in the green circle coming through. And here is where some of the climate change awareness and the education comes. We've got strengthening green skills, growing green communities, developing data and research, flourishing learning spaces, expanding educative capacity. And then key here in the center, not just Western knowledge about science, about what they knew about the land and how the land changed over time, which informs how we can understand climate change. So this is an amazing framework, but how does it get taken up, right? So we've got it again. Here's the policy. It's calling for education. Excellent. Where is it in the curriculum document? Well, there's a little bit of good news. So the curriculum reviews that I shared with you were all done, I think the latest one was published in 2023, did not include what's happening in Ontario. This is the most recent curriculum document to come out. Climate change is an important topic addressed in age-appropriate learning throughout the strands of science and technology curriculum. While climate change concepts and discussions address important environmental concerns, it's important to also foster hope and optimism, so addressing that climate anxiety piece, when teaching about and learning about climate change and other environmental issues. So the goal, students will develop the skills and knowledge needed to understand the causes, human activities, let's get that 60% up to 100, and the potential innovative solutions and the mitigation strategies related to climate change and other environmental issues. They'll also learn how they can make the most environmentally responsible decisions possible given the choices they have. So this is in the document. Every student is going to be taking a course that has this underpinning. And the science and technology curriculum for grades 1 to 8 has 7 prescribed learning outcomes that say climate change in them. So it's there, we're getting it. Science 10 is a required course, and it used to have a unit about our changing world. It now has a unit on climate change, so it is explicit, it's being addressed and covered. Now, what happens in Canada with curriculum change? Once it's happened in one jurisdiction, when another jurisdiction goes to make the change, they say, what is everybody else doing and what are other countries doing? So with this in place, it is likely to spread in the curriculum documents, we hope. So even though climate change not big in our curriculum documents per se, environmental learning is, okay? And one of the projects that I have been working on in the past few years is a series of books about science education in Canada and science education research. All right, so here's one example, and this was a team of authors, well, researchers, one based in Alberta and one in Newfoundland, which is far to the east. And one case was grade 4, working in a prairie community. Place-conscious pedagogy, which goes beyond place-based, which you might have heard of. And place-based means you're letting the land sort of inform what you're doing. Place-conscious, these authors say, is more about the actions that students will take. So again, not just learning, actually thinking about and doing. And in grade 4, they went out and they learned about their local community and the environment. And then they wrote a guidebook for other people. So not just writing something for the teacher, today I learned that, but they actually put together a book. They engaged local culture and environmental interactions, working with their environment as the landscape for learning. The grade 10 students in Newfoundland were in a small port community, so right on the ocean, and the students there were investigating an invasive species. They went off and they were working with the Department of Fisheries, and they were collecting data for them, so almost a citizen science project. But they were working towards specific curriculum outcomes. They did not say how many green crabs are there living in Newfoundland, but looking at the skills and the competencies, the teachers were able to say, yes, we are meeting the prescribed expectations, looking at maintaining quality of life for the future generation, and here are some of the outcomes. So this is part of the grade 4 guidebook, which I just think is amazing. So they're writing the typical sort of life cycle about the animal, but the purpose is so much more than a report for the teacher. And I chose the page about the moose because that's sort of our representative Canadian animal. And then the grade 10 students actually geared up and were out in the ocean collecting samples, amongst other things. And it was a very meaningful activity for the students and for the teacher, who continued to talk about what they learned from that day, not just knowledge, but again, that affective, that attitudinal. All right, next case, ocean literacy. And this particular project actually was developed to focus on climate change. It was the only one in all of the chapters in those books that said anything about climate change specifically. Here it is. There, the rising ocean temperature, coral bleaching, the die-off of some species, etc. Bringing in local communities, including Indigenous people, leading towards sustainable solutions. So again, you see the same kinds of ideas coming out over and over again. Action, sustainable, Indigenous people involvement. And this particular pair of teachers and researchers said, you know what, the textbook is really, it's terrestrial based. So it's again, focused on the land. We live in Newfoundland, we're surrounded by ocean. We need to know more about the ocean. So they developed some hands-on inquiry activities in a sustainability unit so that they could get their students engaged in their environment, learning about ocean literacy, thinking about climate change. And these are a couple of the activities that students were working on. So looking at the albedo, the solar radiation and measures of that, and then changing pH by blowing CO2, like blowing bubbles through a straw, and monitoring that. So they're learning how to use some of the technology, the tools and equipment while exploring. One other thing that they did is they did sort of a typical heating and cooling water and currents, but they used iceberg ice to cool because they're in Newfoundland and there's icebergs. So again, using what they had to make it real and meaningful for the students. This chapter talked about relational and Indigenous epistemologies, so thinking about how we relate to one another and to beings that are non-human potentially. So 13 and 14-year-olds went off and explored a local park, and then in another example in the same chapter, Indigenous youth were doing water stewardship activities, so learning. The key here was deep connections to more than human, relating to place. So that's a repetitive key as well. And then some social justice issues. The last one is grades 1-2. So to show you that you can start really young, you can get the children out there. If you've got anything resembling the outdoors, take your children out. And here, this particular study was founded on the idea that human well-being can be fostered by meeting needs and developing capabilities in nature. Okay? Now, I was just on Jeju, and there's actually like a forest bathing place there. So that idea is not unknown here either. But really taking the time to recognize, enjoy, and explore the environment in a meaningful way. And the young children were taken out with the teacher. They explored, they listened, they asked questions, and they came up with some student-led initiatives. So even the young ones taking action. They didn't just want to do a nature walk. They thought they could do a nature walk and do a litter cleanup at the same time, so if they found any. Do classroom garbage measurement, develop a classroom habitat for animals or, well, fish or animals, do some water stewardship, do a rain inquiry, and recognizing that nature and the natural world can spark imagination, curiosity, and thought, key attributes for tackling climate change. Okay? So those were just some of the examples. I think I may have captured them as I've been talking. All right. So that's climate change education, the Canadian take. How does that relate to the Hazard Literacy Center? Well, I had some fun exploring that because the idea of hazard literacy was a new thought for me, although it makes total sense. And then I thought, well, what hazards does Canada have? And how can I tie that to climate change? Well, climate change, oh, but right there, okay. And it turns out that our Department of Natural Resources says heat waves, heavy rainfall, and wildfires are extreme weather events linked to human-caused climate change. So we've been having heat events in Canada. We never used to have those in my memory when I was a child. Warm weather was 24, 25 degrees on the coast, maybe 30 in Ottawa. We now have places to go in Ottawa when it gets too hot. It's like a respite center. You can go and cool down. We've had deaths related to heat events, which 10 years ago we would not ever have thought about. Flooding, on the other hand, is our most common weather-related catastrophe because that will tend to happen along the coast, rivers and lakes, and we have a lot of rivers and lakes. So that's probably the most, the one that we can all share some experience of, spring runoff and the melting and it's flood season. Wildfires, and so doubled since the 70s in terms of the amount of area burnt, and expected to double again by 2010, or 2100. And so that's something really impactful that we can share with the students who are now starting to have a taste of some of these things, specifically related to climate change, which is specifically related to human activity. And in kind of a representation of how contrary we tend to be in Canada. So we're concerned about climate change. We don't believe it's caused by human activity, but we're concerned about natural disasters as well. So we somehow have to make that connection a little more strongly for our young people and our students. So we're concerned about it. Well, here are some of the things that might be impacting us. And you can see on the map, again, this isn't saying that these things only happen in these areas, but they tend to be more specific, like pests like the pine beetle have impacted a wide area in British Columbia. Drought typically is in the center of the province, whereas over here we have some concerns about sea level rise along the coast. So these are some of the things that we can talk about with our students, but making sure that we leave them with some hope and optimism, because this is doom and gloom. If you are a science educator or an educator in any way, you want to make sure that you're leaving with an action plan and some idea of hope or empowerment. That's really important. I hope I've done that for you. We'll see how we bring to the end. So here are just a couple of recent headlines, all from 2026 3 of them from March that are linked to climate change and then some issues that we need to deal with. Vancouver, first snow this winter in 43 years, which is kind of interesting because it doesn't really snow much in Vancouver anyways. If it does snow, it's usually, but it regularly has snowed. Okay. Central BC, heavy rain. Saskatchewan, we've got weather records broken with brutal cold, minus 41. Which is why we don't call it global warming, by the way. We tend to try to stick to climate change. For a while, we did say global warming, and the people who experienced minus 41 said, it's not warming here, but it's definitely changing. And there's flood watch. This spring, like clockwork, we're on a flood watch in Ottawa. All of those can be traced back to human activities. So those represent kind of the things that Canadians face. A little bit different from the Korean context. In the Korean context, if there is a disaster or a hazard event, you're likely connected to it in some way, and it's really close, right? Like you're not far. As I say, if there's a hazard on one side of the country, it's 4,000 kilometers. Like it could be another planet practically. So that's something that we have to overcome in Canada as well. Just that, okay, what's relevant? Being aware. Travel is good. Okay. All right. So we have a national adaptation strategy. So this is where hopefully the empowerment comes. So, okay, doom and gloom. Yes, climate change is happening. Well, what are we going to do about it? Let's act on meeting some of the changes. I have a friend who works in environmental education at Royal Roads University in Victoria, BC, and she says, you know, we don't know where we're going, and it looks really ugly right now, but think about an egg and an egg hatching, and if you didn't know what was happening, that's kind of ugly looking too. Like the shell cracks, oh no, this thing of beauty broken into pieces, and then what is that that's coming out? But it eventually turns into a bird, which is usually quite beautiful if you take the time to look at it, whether it's a chicken or a duck or a peacock. That's where we are. We're at the egg cracking, okay? We have the power to make some changes so that it's going to be, hopefully, a beautiful bird coming up. Okay? So we're looking at disaster resilience, looking at the disasters, looking at the resilience, looking at health and well-being, nature and biodiversity, and how we can ensure that we don't have any more species loss, infrastructure, and yes, economy and workers. So it's got to be there, but it's not the main focus. There it is. It's a nice cycle again. It's similar to the framework that I shared earlier, but it has, I have to get this, well, we'll go through it. Okay, so it's got 5 key parts, and we need to adjust, assess, prioritize, plan, and implement, and it just keeps cycling around. We want to be looking at how are things working, what is happening, what matters the most, what can we do about it, and how can we implement that strategy. So again, trying to put things into action, and just pointing out again, we've got the Indigenous aspect here, which is really important. And you can see that economics doesn't stand out quite as largely as it used to, which is great. I think we're moving in the right direction. Ideas away, yes, we can learn even from things that were bad. We can take that data and move forward in a better and stronger way. All right, thank you.